Hey guys, it's me, Maximilian Zantis, and welcome to the very first episode of Making Music in the Style of. Today we are going to be making Hotline Miami inspired music, but before I actually start, I have a little quick thing to say to my old German subscribers. I'm not going to do that in this video though, so be sure to check the description, there will be a video linked somewhere, and I'm gonna explain everything to you, so be sure to check that out. But without further ado, let's get started with making music inspired by Hotline Miami. So, not only is this the very first episode of Making Music in the Style of, but it's also a very special episode. Because, first of all, Hotline Miami is one of my personal favorite games. And additionally, it introduced me to synthwave in the first place. Rosentwig was originally created for making Hotline Miami-esque music. Rosentwig, if you didn't know, is the name under which I produce music that is not a direct part of my work as a composer. And still to this day, my music as Rosentwig is very synthwavy, but it has been leaning more towards the chill side for quite a while now. But let's get back to Hotline Miami. Since the soundtrack of both Hotline Miami 1 and Hotline Miami 2 is full of different artists, I will actually be talking about two major categories of Hotline Miami music. The first one is actually the kind of music you've been hearing in the background. It's the more ambient-oriented music, meaning pieces like Untitled, The Green Kingdom, which is one of my favorite tracks of the second game. And then we have the stuff you guys probably came for, the more hard-hitting music. Tracks like Technor by Perturbator, featuring Nordico, or Voyager by Gesaffelstein Björn. I'm sorry for butchering names here. So yeah, okay. But before I actually start talking about those categories, a quick disclaimer. I'm not trying to replicate specific tracks or styles one by one. This is not a how to remake video. This series is just a way for me to make inspired music with my own twist to it. It's basically like I'm pretending I would have been composing and producing for the game, or film, or artists, or whatever we're doing. And of course, this series is for you guys. Either just to entertain, or maybe give people a glimpse on how music production works. Or maybe even give a few tips to fellow composers or producers. I'm basically trying to make this interesting for all people that are interested in music. Okay, this was definitely enough pre-talk. Let's get going with the actual video. Let's first talk about tools of trade, meaning what should I use to make this kind of music? Okay, so you're gonna need a digital audio workstation. If you try this on tape, definitely let me know. A synthesizer capable of making analog sounding synths. I use Massive and Serum for this, but you could of course go with actual analog gear or emulations of old gear like Arturia stuff or Yuhi's products. A reverb that has a room reverb setting. I can personally only recommend Valhalla Vintage Verb or Valhalla Room, but you can of course use any reverb. Drum samples. I'd suggest retro drum machines like the TR-707, Boss DR-660, or maybe even the Lindrum. Remember to use weird percussion sounds as little sparkles in between. Some kind of compressor for general punch. And last but not least, a distortion/saturation unit. Then some other general rules that apply to all of the soundtrack. The Hotline Miami soundtrack is, like I said, heavily analog synth driven. That doesn't mean that all of the synths used are actually analog, but all of them have the sonic nature of analog gear. There are also a few other instruments here and there, like a bass guitar for example, but most of the sound comes out of synthesizers. Synthesizers. One of the things that is, in my opinion, most important for all of the Hotline Miami styles is detune, unison, and chorus. Just with detune and unison alone, you can make some pretty dark and spooky sounding synths. In terms of oscillators or wavetables, so the initial sound generators, if you're going for the classic Hotline sound, you should probably stick to a saw wave for the most part. But of course, you could and should experiment with this. For everybody who doesn't know, oscillators are wavetables in subtractive synthesis, which is the most common way of synthesis, are the basic foundations of sounds, meaning the starting sound upon which we can build and develop into something different and unique. In terms of reverb, like I already said, it's mostly roomy reverb. Listening to the soundtrack, you will notice that not a lot of tracks necessarily have big and spacious reverb. If you're trying to go deep and you're looking for some good reverb references, I can only suggest you guys listening to Gesaffelstein or Gesaffelstein. He has really perfected the room reverb game, and especially Moon's Hotline Miami tracks really remind me of Gesaffelstein's work. So for the ambient category, I'm actually gonna use one of my older tracks. Like I said, I used to make Hotline Miami-esque music, and this track is still pretty good. First of all, BPM. I suggest using something between 80 to 100, but you can go slower or faster if you want. Next up are harmonic and melodic elements. Of course, since this is an ambient track, we're not going super crazy here. Generally speaking, the Hotline Miami soundtrack makes use of a lot of minimal and repetitive harmonic or melodic elements. For this track, for example, it's just a slow arpeggiated descending D minor chord. Arpeggiated means I'm not playing the notes in the chord all together, I'm actually playing them one by one. But since some of the oscillators in the synth patch are tuned to different semitones, meaning different pitches, the actual MIDI information, meaning the notes that are actually being played, would look something like this. Generally, you shouldn't have too much movement in the chord progressions, because if the intervals are too big, they create way too much energy and are just distracting. So don't use your typical EDM chords here. To make chord progression smoother, I suggest you using either chord inversions or just the same chord for your whole progression, and alter the type of chord. For example, you could go from a D minor to a D minor sus2 to a sus4 to a D minor 7. But this is a little bit more advanced, and maybe if you want me to make an extra video of this, let me know. But there are hundreds of videos about music theory on YouTube, and most people are probably way more qualified to talk about this than I am. But in the end, it just boils down to feel. The soundtrack is pretty dark, mysterious, and minimalistic, but also a little bit funky at times. But especially with the ambient tracks, don't try to force things too much. Less is definitely more here. When making or choosing a synth for this kind of style, you should definitely go for a slower sound here. So no harsh attacks and releases, meaning no sounds that start and end super abrupt, like this one for example. But it's also not super long and super reverb heavy stuff. You got to remember that this is still a really fast action game, and even in slower parts, it still fits to the general vibe of the game. Like I said in the beginning, the most important thing is still detuning. The whole unsteady, dark and kind of weird sound comes from detuning and things being not quite in tune. So don't be afraid to experiment with this, but also don't go too crazy. You can totally use percussion as well. In my track, for example, I used a clap sound that has delay on it. I used a soft kick hitting on the first and third beat, some reverby clave sound and some tom fills. Concerning effects, I didn't do too much external stuff. I faded everything in with a low pass, making the classic underwater intro sound I use way too much, some slight saturation and compression. And that is basically it. The production of tracks like this is really not too crazy. The most important part is nailing the atmosphere. And for this, there are generally no real guidelines. Just try it for yourself until you're satisfied. That's at least how I do it. And now to the hard-hitting stuff. Here we're gonna use a track that started out being an idea for the My Friend Pedro soundtrack I was working on. But it ended up drifting way too much into a Hotline Miami direction, probably because in my head all I was thinking of was I'm actually working on a Devolver Digital game. If you didn't know, Devolver Digital published both Hotline Miami games, and like I said, I'm a huge fan. But let's start with tools of trade here. For this track, I used and modified a lot of serum presets from Gogoy's 80s Retro Rave serum pack. I hopefully pronounced that right, which is a great pack, by the way. I'm definitely gonna link to it in the description. Again here, totally go for the detuned and unison saw sound, and also that nice roomy Gesaffelsteiny reverb. I actually took big inspiration from Moon's track Crystals and automated the amount of reverb, creating this weird play and change of space perception, which is a super awesome trick to make your tracks sound way more organic. A lot of the Hotline Miami tracks have heavy arpeggiated bass lines. I decided to go for a more atmospheric bassline here. I used a bass that leans more towards the Reese type of bass, which makes heavy use of phasing and detuning, creating this thick atmosphere, but you could totally go for that nice 80s ARP bass. For percussions, I again used the clap. Claps are a big part of the Hotline Miami sound in my opinion, but don't just use them dry. Add some reverb, maybe even gated reverb or some delay to it. For the kick, go for punchy, thick kicks. One tip for thicker drums in general would be to put a compressor on the drum bass. I also used a shaker instead of a hi-hat, but you can totally go for hi-hats as well. Regarding harmony and melody, the track really only consists of a bass line and an evolving ostinato, which was influenced by Moon's track Dust. You can probably see a pattern here, I really like Moon's music. To change things up, I made use of some effects like playing with the cutoff on the main ostinato and later on changing the actual pattern up a bit. But it's all very straightforward, no extra melody lines or extra fancy stuff. Like I said, this music is pretty minimalistic, but very effective. And yeah, that's basically it. Like I said, this is the very first episode of making music in the style of, so some things are very likely to change in the next episodes, but I'd love to get some feedback from you guys and let me know if you want me to go over a specific game, movie or artists or whatever, or if you have some ideas in general. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe and hit the bell to never miss out on any of my stuff. I will see you very soon with some more content. And of course, I'm not only gonna make this series, but also other stuff. But now let's actually give the track a proper listen. Here we go.